Alrighty, hi class. Thanks for checking in. Today we're going to be covering the beginning of Article 2, all about the executive branch. So you're going to have your notes open alongside this video. So first things first, we're going to talk about Section 1 of Article 2. The first thing you need to jot down is that the main duty, the main job of the executive branch is to carry out laws. So if you think back to my analogy about how Congress is sort of like the playmaker or the coach of a team, the executive branch is like the quarterback. Specifically, the president is like the quarterback, and the rest of the president's team is like the rest of the team. And their job is to carry out the plays, or in this case, the laws. So we're going to talk about how that actually happens on a daily basis. So first things first. In the same way that in Article 1 of the legislative branch, we first talked about the logistics of running for the office of the president, or of Congress, you're going to also learn about the basics of running for the office of the president. So first things first, the term length. You probably know this. It is 4 years. Each presidential term, 4 years long, and there is a 2-term maximum. That did not get added to the Constitution until much later in American history. Actually, after the presidency of FDR, we had the passage of the 22nd Amendment, which then restricted presidents to 2 terms. It is the only branch of any elected office that has term restrictions at the federal level. However, previously, prior to that whole amendment being added, following the presidency of George Washington, it was sort of an unspoken rule that you only served 2 terms max until FDR came in and served 4 consecutive terms, leading us through the Great Depression all the way through World War II. Anyway, they put a cap on it. Now, in order to run for the office of the president, there are 3 requirements. Number 1, you need to be 35 years or older. Number 2, you need to be a resident of the United States for 14 years. And number 3, as written in the Constitution, you need to be a, quote, natural-born citizen. What that means, and you can add this to your notes, is that you have to be born here in the United States. Now, compensation for the office of the president. Number 1, they put this in there right away. Congress cannot alter a president's pay while in office. In other words, Congress cannot ask or presidents cannot ask Congress to change their compensation midterm. That's supposed to prevent corruption or an abuse of power. Number 2, president cannot accept any outside pay while in office. In other words, they can't have a side hustle, right? The president is not allowed to drive Uber on the side while being in this position. They need to just focus on this job. And then the last tidbit of this section is the current pay. This is obviously not in the Constitution because it's changed over time, but currently the president makes $400,000 a year. That's more than any other elected or appointed official in D.C. at the federal level. That's more than Congress members and more than Supreme Court justices. However, typically what ends up happening, depending on how wealthy the president is they end up only accepting what they say is typically $1 of that, including the past few presidents, because it is taxpayer money. And typically people that become president are very wealthy. Not all, but typically. Now, the picture at the bottom, I wanted to talk specifically about then President Trump because, as you know, and maybe you've heard, then President Trump is a very successful businessman. And so one of the main things he had to do when he became the president, after he got elected in November of 2016, 2015, I guess, he had to prove that he was not making money from any of his outside businesses. Think hotels, golf courses, right? And so he held a press conference, and this is a picture of that. But if you see all these files right here, he has to justify why he is not violating this clause, the compensation clause. He is not making any money. And basically, it was a bunch of legal documents removing any ties that he had had financially to any of those businesses. Okay. Succession. First things first, what is succession? Succession is simply that when something happens to a position of power, it's a plan of action in cases of emergency to make sure that someone is always in that position. So, for the executive branch, this is what it looks like. The vice president will take over the president in the case of resignation or inability to serve. So, in the case, like we talked about before, of Richard Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford took over as president. He was vice president at the time. Inability to serve. Unfortunately, our country has encountered multiple assassinations in the office of the president, and so we'll talk about those as well, but that's what they typically mean by inability to serve, or incredibly sick and incapable of making any decisions. Now, in the Constitution, they also planned ahead for the rest of the line of succession. It's not just the vice president, right? What if something happens to the president and the vice president? After the vice president, the line of succession includes the following. The next person is the Speaker of the House, which is Nancy Pelosi. After that is someone called the President Pro Tempore, which is the highest ranking part, other than the President of the Senate, That's a guy named Patrick Leahy, who, fun fact, guest starred in Batman. Anyway, look it up. And then the last part of this line of succession is the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Not Anthony, Antony Blinken. So again, if something happened to the president and the vice president, then it would sort of go down this line. It's sort of like a doomsday plan. We don't ever want to have to use it. We have not had to enact the line of succession, obviously past the vice president, in our country's history. And it goes on a lot longer. If you click on the link here, it'll take you, yes, to a Wikipedia page, so bear with me here. But this is the current cabinet of the president, and so it would continue down this line. Remember I said Nancy Pelosi, Patrick Leahy, Antony Blinken. It would go all the way down this line right here for the rest of the line of succession. Okay. Now, some other examples of midterm changes in positions of power. In 1963, unfortunately, President JFK was assassinated when he was in Dallas, and his vice president, Johnson, took over for him. And the line of succession is not something that happens slowly. It happens incredibly quickly because we are always, as a country, trying to make sure that there is somebody as the head of state, right? Somebody in that position of power. Otherwise, it may leave our country open to attack. So again, it's seen as a national security issue. This picture is of then President Johnson taking over for, unfortunately, JFK after he was killed, just 2 hours and 8 minutes after he was assassinated. And it's actually even on an airplane. You can kind of see that happening here. All right. There are other vice presidents that have become presidents midterm. This is the list here. There's a lot to them. You could really dive into the different sort of stories that have happened, some more significant and noteworthy than others. Here's Johnson after the assassination of JFK. I talked a little bit about Nixon. We talked about impeachment. There's Gerald Ford. And there's quite a few others. Obviously, you've probably heard of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So with that, we've finished section 1 of Article 2.